Well, thank you all for being here today on this webinar. My name is May Matchim. I am the Natural Heritage Education Coordinator at the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust, and I'm really excited to get to present to you today about queer ecology, which is one of my favorite topics. Before we get into that, we'll begin with a little introduction, and you can find out a little bit more about what a land trust is and what land trusts do. Just give me 1 second here. All right, so thank you for joining us here today. This is the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust. I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We would like to start by acknowledging that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connections with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine. These lands are the meeting places of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, and Beausoleil, and of the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island, the nations of the Williams Treaty. We would like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing the land with us. We acknowledge this land and the people because the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous people and their inherent right to the land, that they have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day. We need to continue a lifelong journey of understanding how our collective past brought us to where we are today, and how to create a better future for our relationship with Indigenous peoples and with the land. We give our gratitude to the Indigenous peoples on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine who have a deep kinship of reciprocity with this land and have since time immemorial. We recognize that working together will strengthen our responsibility to the land by including ecological traditional knowledge systems for an equitable and sustainable future. What does the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust do? So 90% of the land on the moraine is privately owned. And so we work with landowners to help protect ecosystems and habitat for future generations. And we have several tools that we use to do this. So a land trust is a nonprofit. It's a charitable organization that can acquire land or interest in land, like easements, for the purposes of protecting the environment. So we raise money to help purchase land and maintain conservation easements in order to protect the ecological features of those properties. And we're required legally to protect those properties forever. We are never able to change our minds 40 years from now and put a condo up. So this is how the Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust protects the moraine. We contribute to the federal government's goal of protecting 30% of land by 2030. We connect people with nature. We do a lot of educational stuff, like what we're doing right now, but we also do things like school visits and guided walks and events like that. And we support climate change resiliency. And with your support, we protect ecologically significant land on and near the moraine. And one of the ways that we're able to do this is through a fabulous program the federal government runs through the Canada Revenue Agency called the Ecological Gifts Program, which gives property owners a great tax break if they either donate their land or they do a conservation easement. So that's definitely something to worth looking into. One exciting thing we're doing right now is we're doing habitat restoration for an endangered songbird called the Kirtland's warbler. We have a site out in Northumberland near Ganaraska Forest that we're restoring to this lost oak pine sandy soil habitat. Before the arrival of European colonizers, a lot of Ontario in the south was covered with oak savannas and prairies and grasslands, which were maintained through traditional ecological practices, particularly controlled burns. But the European colonizers suppressed that, and the populations of animals that depended on these habitats, like the Kirtland's warbler, eastern meadowlark, the Carner blue butterfly, the hognose snake, they declined sharply. And so we are restoring this habitat to benefit a number of species, not just the Kirtland's warbler. And we're doing all sorts of great programming around that, including volunteer seed collection. So I'm going to put a link in the chat in a second for anyone who's interested in volunteering or finding out an event. And there are some fun things coming up over the next little while. We have in July a guided walk about spiders with a spider expert. And we have the return of our moth night on June 11th, from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m., which is at a private conservation reserve we have up near Schomberg, Ontario. These are both groups of animals that I know very little about. So I'm really excited that I get to do a little bit of work with them and get to learn a little bit more. So yes, the moth night will be Oh, sorry. I spelled it wrong. You're right, Jessica. It's July 11th. All right. So usually this is where I introduce my guest, but today I am my guest. So I'm going to go right into it and start my presentation all about queer ecology. I'm just going to throw that link very quickly in the chat there for anyone who wants to volunteer with the Land Trust. Just give me 1 second here. One sec. I don't know where the chat went. That's okay. Oh, there it is. Perfect. That's the link to the volunteers, and I will begin my presentation. All right, so welcome to the amazing world of queer ecology. My name is Maxwell Matchim. My pronouns are they, them. I am queer. I am transgender. I am a trans femme, which if you don't know is someone who's assigned male at birth, but identifies on the feminine side of things. They could be a trans woman, or they just like things a little bit more on the feminine side. And I'm also a naturalist. I love the outdoors. I love birding. I love botany. And sometimes those things haven't always felt compatible. I know when I was first birding, I was really guarded about my identity. I know I experienced firsthand a lot of misogynistic, racist, homophobic comments and jokes out in the field, sort of in existing birding groups, and in parks around the GTA. And only fairly recently have I started to be more open about who I am. And I've gotten involved with a lot of different organizations like the Toronto Feminist Bird Club, which works really hard to create more equitable outdoor spaces for people. I'm involved with Pride Month events for the Ontario Field Ornithologists, and the Pride Month events with my work here, and it's been super gratifying, and it's so nice to be able to meet this community of other queer people that are really into nature. But one of the things that I found most affirming actually is researching into the diversity of gender and sexuality in nature. And that's one thing that's helped me feel really great about myself and who I am. So much so that I'm making a documentary about it, and I'll include a link to that in the chat at some point as well. So, what is queer ecology? Queer ecology is a field of sort of diverse disciplines ranging from the arts to the philosophy of science to biology and social sciences, which has developed in the past 25 years. There was one book which we'll talk about, which was particularly influential, called Biological Exuberance by an author named Bruce Bagmill, which came out in 1999. And the whole field of queer ecology is working to challenge a lot of the heteronormative um, and gender binary based assumptions that have influenced Western scientific thought over the past few hundred years. Um, and so there's people taking it from all different angles. There are people who are biologists, people who lead organizations like the Queer Forest Club here in Toronto. Um, there's someone like Patagonia, who we have here, who's a drag queen who works for the National Park Service in the US, who uses drag as a way to bring awareness to both social justice and environmental issues. Organizations like the Feminist Bird Club, which I mentioned earlier. But it is an academic discipline as well. And I'd say in the past 25 years that the public understanding of queer animal life has grown really rapidly. To the point where it's kind of a part of pop culture now. And there's a lot of news articles each year that are like, we just found out this fish can change sex, or, it turns out that the whales are gay or whatever. But it's unnatural, you might hear. That's often the first thing you hear when you start to talk about the diversity of gender and sexuality in nature. Um, Here's a few fun facts for you. I've included in-text citations in this presentation just because a lot of the time I get resistance from people who are like, well, you made that up, or that's just anecdotal or whatever. So fully cited. So according to Monk 2019, over 1,500 animal species engage in same-sex mating. Over 130 bird species engage in homosexual behavior. Over 500 species of fish change sexes over the course of their lives, sometimes more than once. Sex change is a natural part of amphibian biology, And there's a species of ginger in the rainforests of China, which changes its sex twice a day, every day. It starts off producing pollen in the morning as a male, and then partway through the day switches to being a female and producing ovules. And I believe there's a specimen of it at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Hamilton. So if you're ever in the Hammer, that's something worth checking out. Why didn't I learn about this at school? Well, the simple answer is homophobia. We'll get into this a little bit more later in the presentation, but there's a lot of reasons why this information has been suppressed and why it's hasn't been part of the popular consciousness for the past few decades. A lot of it had to do with scientists worrying about their reputations. So a lot of scientists were worried that they'd be perceived as gay themselves simply for reporting on their findings. A lot of papers actively excluded data about queer animal behavior. And as recently as 1980, there was a report on killer whale biology and behavior, which when published by the US government, removed all references to homosexuality. So it was totally censored. So there's a lot of reasons why historically this information um, wasn't wasn't well known and wasn't getting published in scientific papers. A lot of like younger scientists too, of course, are worried about getting tenure, worried about getting their articles published in journals, worried about their reputation in the field. So it sort of creates this chilling effect where historically a lot of this stuff, although it was being reserved and had been for several hundred years, there's um, studies about queer animal behavior that go back to the 18th and 19th century, it wasn't getting its due because of those institutional barriers, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail later on. So why did sex evolve in the first place? Sexual reproduction has existed for between 1 to 2 billion years. I think the first fossil evidence is over 1 billion years old. And we have two examples here of organisms that reproduce asexually by spore, liverworts and yeasts. And when you reproduce asexually, you're creating a clone of yourself. So your offspring is going to be a complete genetic copy of yourself. So what's the advantage to sexual reproduction? Well, it allows for a lot more genetic diversity. You can see that example on the left there of Darwin's finches, whose beaks evolved over time to respond to the different conditions on different islands in the Galapagos. If you combine some of the genes from one parent with some of the genes of another parent, you're getting greater genetic diversity, and that allows if something like a mass extinction event happens, or there's a new predator that shows up on the scene, if there's some sort of disease or natural disaster, that makes you a lot more able to resist that. Some of your offspring will be able to survive. And so it's really helpful from an evolutionary perspective to have sex and reproduce that way. It's important to reproduce through spores where you're just copying yourself. And to emphasize the importance of genetic diversity, I have a picture on the right there of King Charles II of Spain, which is an example of limited genetic diversity. So why did sexes evolve? I'm a non-binary person. I'm a trans person. So I get a little bit tongue-tied sometimes talking about the gender binary and the development of sex. But in the most basic scientific terms, the two sexes which many organisms have, the male and female, they developed so that one could share the smaller gamete, which we often call a sperm, and one could share the larger gamete, which we often call an egg. And when those two are combined together, the egg is fertilized and an offspring develops. So when it gets down to it, that is really the only difference between male and female organisms, whether they're plants, animals, or anything else. There's an example there of the scarlet tanager, and they're a sexually dimorphic species, which we'll talk about a little bit. So the male looks different than the female. So one interesting subversion of heteronormativity is the idea that reproduction, that a male and female partner together is the norm, and that sexual reproduction is the norm, are the unisexual mole salamanders. And this is a fascinating group of salamanders which exists in southern Ontario, all around the Great Lakes, in places like Michigan, all the way up to New England. And they're very closely related species. You may have heard of the Jefferson salamander. It's here around the Oak Ridges Moraine, along with the blue spotted salamander. The Jefferson salamander is endangered. There's a species called the smallmouth salamander, which only exists on Pelee Island in Ontario, and it's also a species at risk. And some of these salamanders, the unisexuals, are completely female. So these populations have no males in them, and they reproduce without sex. And scientists recently determined that they've been doing this for between 3 and 4 million years. It's the longest and most sophisticated lineage of unisexual vertebrates anywhere in the world. And basically, their relatives, like the blue-spotted and Jefferson salamander, they reproduce in these giant mass mating events, which take place in the early spring in March and April in vernal pools, which are like temporary wetlands that form in forests from rainwater and melting snow. And oftentimes there'll be sort of errant sperm left over after these huge mating events, and the unisexual male salamanders can come along and they'll come in contact with that sperm, and it will cause them to become pregnant. That might seem pretty simple. The unisexual comes in contact with the sperm, it enters their body, it fertilizes their egg. The truth is a lot more complicated, actually. Most of the time, it simply tells the unisexual salamander that it's time to reproduce, and she'll produce young, so she'll lay her eggs, but they won't be exact clones of her. They'll express her genes differently. So some of the young could be more spotted, could be brighter, could be darker. In other cases, she can absorb the sperm for up to 5 different salamander species in the Ambystoma genus and incorporate the chromosomes from all of them into her young, which is remarkable. That's like combining the chromosomes of a lion, a tiger, a leopard, and a cheetah into one animal. So scientists have no idea why they evolved this strategy or quite how they're able to do it, but they're a fascinating subversion of heteronormativity, and it's taking place right here in our backyards here in Southern Ontario. So before I go into the next section, I'll give you a note on terminology. So when we're talking about humans, we never use the term hermaphrodite. That's offensive to members of the intersex community. But within the context of biology, scientists still use the word hermaphrodite. So please never refer to a human by that term. And we're going to talk about a few different types of organisms which subvert the gender binary. So there are some organisms called simultaneous hermaphrodites. And the ones you're probably most familiar with are earthworms, terrestrial snails, and slugs, although some sea slugs, and one species of fish called the mangrove killifish, which you find from Florida all the way down to South America, are also simultaneous hermaphrodites. And that simultaneous hermaphrodites have both the quote-unquote male and quote-unquote female sex organ at the same time. Now, sometimes they can fertilize themselves, like the mangrove killifish can actually fertilize its own eggs, which is super cool. Sometimes, particularly amongst some slug and snail species, they'll mate as in a quote-unquote male role or in a quote-unquote female role, depending on the scenario, and they'll take on different roles at different points in their lives. But they have 2 different sets of sex organs, as opposed to sequential hermaphrodites. So these are organisms which change from one sex to another over the course of their lives. Famously, clownfish sort of have a reputation now for their ability to change sex. So a lot of the time, male clownfish, it all has to do with the social hierarchy in the groups of clownfish on the reefs. If there's a female removed, whether she gets eaten or what have you, or dies, one of the males will take her place and will become a female. But we see the same thing in, as I said earlier, over 500 species of fish. Usually it's the other way around, actually, where a female will become male. But we also see it in, we have some limpets and oysters, snails. You can see that cleaner shrimp there, some species of butterfly, and even a few plants like red maple and striped maple, which we have up in Northern Ontario, Central Ontario, around like Algonquin, and Jack in the pulpit. Jack in the pulpit is really interesting for its ability to change sex. Scientists have found that in areas where there's a lot of foraging by deer, that the population will skew male, and more of them will change sex to be male. They usually do it on an annual basis, and they think that that's probably an evolutionary strategy so that there's more males able to, send their pollen out and fertilize the remaining females. Those are sequential hermaphrodites. Plants, we'll get a little bit into like high school biology here. A lot of plants are monoecious, and here's some examples of monoecious plants that you can find in the Oak Ridges Moraine and throughout the Northeast here. And these are species which produce both separate male and female flowers on the same plant. So things like white pine, walnut, hornbeam, alder, tamarack, birch, hazels, they all produce a separate male and female flower on the same plant, which is a nice little subversion of things. Um, Most angiosperms, so flowering plants, are hermaphrodites. So we can see in this diagram here that most angiosperms have both a pistil and a stamen. And if you think back to high school biology days, the pistil is the quote unquote female part of the flower, which produces the ovule. The ovule is kind of like the egg. Once it gets fertilized by pollen, it will become a seed. And then there's the stamen as well in the same flower. And that's the quote unquote male part of the flower, which produces pollen. And there's a few different evolutionary strategies which angiosperms have developed. So something like wild strawberry, which is a super common wildflower we have around here, can actually pollinate itself. And that's a strategy with more limited genetic diversity. But something like fireweed, which is a plant that we get more in northern and central Ontario, and then up in like BC and the territories. I think it's found in just about every province in territory in Canada, is dichogamous. And that's when the pistil and the stamen of the same flower mature at different times. And this way, it doesn't accidentally pollinate itself. And that is a strategy which is believed to have developed to increase genetic diversity. Because if you're pollinating yourself, it's using your same genes over and over again. So one of my favorite groups of animals which can subvert the gender binary are frogs. So there's at least 3 species of frogs now, which have been found to be able to change sexes over the course of their lives. And that one paper, Lambert 2019, which we mentioned earlier, concluded that it's a totally natural part of the of amphibian biology. And it's relatively frequent. Up to 12% of some populations of green frogs are the frogs are changing sexes, and it's happening both in isolated, pristine forest habitats that are miles from human roads and habitation, as well as polluted suburban environments where there's a lot of habitat modification. And when scientists compared the rates of sex change, they found that there was actually no correlation between the environments or pollution levels. So it appears to be just a totally natural part of being a frog. So the next time that your uncle tells you that the frogs are changing sexes because they put chemicals in the water, you can say, well, actually, Maxwell told me on the webinar that it's a completely natural part of amphibian biology. Here's another absolutely fabulous example of organisms which can subvert the gender binary. So these are called gynandromorphs. And it's a phenomenon which is seen in a lot of different types of organisms. This is probably the most famous picture. This one went viral back in 2019. A really lovely birder out in Erie, Pennsylvania named Shirley Caldwell took this picture. And as you can see, we talked about earlier, some birds are sexually dimorphic. So the male cardinal is red and the female cardinal is sort of that orangish brown. But this cardinal, it looks like it's perfectly split down the middle. I remember seeing this image and feeling like, oh, I can relate to this so much. It was such an affirming thing to see. That's a gynandromorph. And when it's perfectly split down the middle like that, scientists call them a bilateral gynandromorph because it's bilaterally symmetrical. What happens is most bird egg cells contain one nuclei, but sometimes there are bird eggs which have 2 nuclei in them. And when a sperm carrying a male set of chromosomes, quote unquote, and another sperm carrying a quote unquote female set of chromosomes fertilize each of the nuclei, it allows that egg to develop into a single organism, which is perfectly half male and half female. And gynandromorphs don't just occur in birds, although they occur in a wide variety of birds, everything from kingfishers and kestrels to orioles and warblers and finches, and even domestic chickens. It's also found in a lot of insects, arachnids, crustaceans, things like lobsters. More rarely, it's found in other vertebrates. It's also been reported in mice, lizards, and garter snakes. This is a really cool specimen that I was able to see a couple months ago with my film crew at the collections of the Canadian Museum of Nature in Gatineau, Quebec. So this is an evening grosbeak, which is a type of finch we have here. And you can see the male there is all yellow like that, and the female is a little bit more drab. And this particular specimen is perfectly split down the middle. So this is a bilateral gynandromorph. And the tag even noted testy on left side, ovary on right. And one really neat thing was within the past 2 or 3 years, there was a Gynandromorph lazuli bunting specimen, which is a relative of like the indigo bunting in the cardinal that lives out west, that I believe was taken in Montana. They found that it actually had a fully developed egg inside its ovary, the single ovary on the one side of its body. So they're still able to produce eggs. And Gynandromorphs have been seen pairing with other birds, which is also really cool. So andromorphs are another interesting way that birds are able to sort of subvert the gender binary. So there's particularly in waterfowl, although in several different types of birds, older females begin to take on a more male plumage with time. There actually hasn't been very much research done into this, but scientists generally assume that it has to do with um, higher levels of testosterone, changing that plumage over time. So you can see this is on the right. This is a picture of a mallard that I saw out in Guelph, Ontario, back in January when I was doing some filming, and it has that orangish bill like the female with the black on it, or gray, but it's starting to get a greenish head like the male, and you can see like the mantle like on the wings. It's starting to take on more of that light gray color that the male has as well. So it's a really interesting sort of intermediate between the two. There's some other great examples of birds um, which sort of subvert that binary as well. So the hooded warbler, in some populations, up to 12% of the females are visually indistinguishable from males. And that's another species where females begin to take on a more masculine plumage with time. Again, scientists aren't really sure why, but it probably has to do with testosterone levels. So these are some specimens I took a picture of at the ROM a few weeks ago with Mark Peck. And you can see at the bottom there is a quote unquote normal female, and at the very top is a quote unquote normal male with the dark hood and bib. And the one in the middle is an older female that's starting to get that hood and that bib. And some specimens of the female hooded warbler, as I said, are completely indistinguishable from the males. Another species which does this is the red-winged blackbird. So a lot of us are familiar with the male red-winged blackbird. I guess ornithologists are misogynistic and name the bird after the male plumage. The female is brown and streaky like a sparrow, but you can see on the right here, this is an older female red-winged blackbird, which this picture was sent to me by a researcher named Maren Gimple at the Foreman Branch Bird Observatory in Maryland. And she is starting to look more masculine with age. So all sorts of fascinating examples. I know my friend Alessandra, who does bird banding, recently I was up at McGregor Point Provincial Park for the Huron Fringe Festival and found a female American robin, which was the size and weight of a male. Like it was just a massive, massive female. So it was an interesting, another interesting example of how birds are always sort of challenging our assumptions about these things. One of the most extreme examples of this is the split gill mushroom. Fungi don't have sexes the same way that animals and plants do. They have something called sex types, which scientists believe sexes evolved from. And they're basically genetically distinct varieties of the same species, which are able to mate when their spores come together and produce offspring. So the split gill mushroom has over 23,000 sex types, sometimes described as over 28,000 sex types. So it is, and they evolved this way to be extremely sexually compatible. So if you have over 23,000 sex types, it's very unlikely that the split gill mushroom on the dead log across the trail from you is going to be the same sex type. And split gill mushroom is a fantastically successful species, which is found on every continent except Antarctica, I believe. Yeah, they're found across Ontario. I've seen them in High Park before. Another interesting thing that birds do to sort of subvert the expected gender roles is female song. And this is something that my friend Alessandra turned me on to. I remember learning as a kid that male birds were the ones that sang. And only pretty recently have scientists begun to realize just how extensive and widespread female birdsong is. So this is a list from a 2018 study of several Ontario species where the females sing. I thought that was pretty cool. And plumage is another one. That's another sort of stereotype we hear a lot, is that the male bird has the flashier plumage. The female is a little bit more drab. Here's a few good examples. The belted kingfisher is probably the most familiar one here. That female has a really lovely sort of brownish red band across the chest, but there's species like the rose-throated Picard, which is down in southern Texas and Mexico, where the female is really cute and brown, and the male is just very generic and gray. And the kelp goose, which is out in like Patagonia in South America, female is so much more interesting looking. The male is. One family of birds which subverts gender expectations on a number of levels, and it's the phalaropes. So you can see there that the female Wilson's phalarope, like all phalaropes, is much more brilliantly colored than the male. The male is much more drab. But that also extends to their behavior. So female phalaropes don't incubate their eggs. The males do. Males are the sole child care providers in that relationship. The female just mates with him and then flies away and mates with as many other males as she pleases, and then flies back to the ocean to feed. And it's the male who spends those weeks caring for the eggs and the young. And there's a few other shorebird species that do this too. The spotted sandpiper, which breeds around the Oak Ridges Moraine and along the Great Lakes, does this. The males primarily take care of the children. And then several Jictana species, which is like a cool type of shorebird that they have in Central and South America. The males also care for the young and incubate the eggs. So it's an interesting version of expectations with childcare. All right, so birds do it. Bees do it. It's homosexual behavior in wildlife. So all of these species here were described in Bruce Bagmel's 1999 book, Biological Exuberance, as engaging in homosexual behavior. And that book, I'll show it to you at the end of the presentation, is incredibly thick, incredibly well researched. Bruce went through several hundred years of research to find any and all references he could to homosexual behavior in wildlife. And he found it was extremely common, everything from mites and spiders to things like whales, muskox, chimps, orcas, orangutans, wolves, turtles, skinks, elephants, lions, zebras, bighorn sheep. It's just an astonishing variety of animals in different habitats across the world, all engage in homosexual behavior. And that can take many forms. So that can be courtship, as you can see in this adorable series of photos, these two male mallards courting one another. It can be in affection. This is a great photo of Japanese macaques, which are a species where there's a lot of same-sex female sexual activity going on and complicated hierarchies. They're the same monkeys that you see on TV documentaries hanging out in those hot springs in the mountains of Japan. They just have like the most aspirational lives imaginable. Mating. This is something that was only reported 2 or 3 months ago. The first scientists had never observed or photographed humpback whales mating, and they finally did so off the coast of Hawaii, and both the whales were male. A lot of species, the males have a lot more gay sex than straight sex in their lives. Bighorn sheep, American bison are both great examples of that. And nest building. This is really cute. Only a few years ago at Darlington Provincial Park out in Oshawa, 2 female piping plovers courted one another. They do something really cute called a tilt display, which is like a sort of elaborate dance. And scientists were really surprised to see 2 females doing it for one another. And they had an egg together and they cared for the nest. Unfortunately, the egg did not survive because one of the plovers went missing. But it's an incredibly cute story. But lots of other species also will help each other build nests. Male Canada geese will build nests together, great cormorants, things like that. And a lot of species will raise young together, which is extremely cute. And as you can see from the slide here, everything from grizzly bears to mute swans, gulls, elephants, seals. Some scientists think that it sort of evolved as a sort of a foster care system within a lot of animals' social hierarchies, that same-sex couples will care for young. A lot of the time they'll either adopt young that has been abandoned, or they will, in some cases, like same-sex female gull pairs, sometimes the gulls will also mate with a male, so their eggs will be fertilized, and then they're able to raise their young together. The hooded warbler is a really cute example of this. They're sort of a famous species that breeds here in the Oak Ridges Moraine. You can find them out in places like Happy Valley near Schaumburg. And a lot of the time, the male hooded warblers will form a pair bond and they will build a nest together and they will raise young together. Um, when female hooded warblers have a nest and it gets attacked, something like a squirrel or a snake takes one of the eggs or just sort of spooks the mother, a lot of the time she'll abandon it. And so these male hooded warbler couples will swoop in and be foster parents for those abandoned eggs. And another instance in which they're able to raise young together is when brown-headed cowbirds lay their eggs in the nest they make. Cowbirds are really interesting. They're nest parasites, so they don't build their own nests. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds and rely on them to raise it. And most of the time, the birds are none the wiser. I've seen in High Park in Toronto a blue-gray gnatcatcher, which is a bird that's a little bit larger than a hummingbird. It's absolutely tiny, feeding a baby cowbird, which was probably 4 or 5 times its size. So usually it's framed by ecologists as a really negative thing, that these cowbirds are being parasites and they're sort of taking advantage of these poor other birds. But it works out really well for the male hooded warblers. It's also really important to acknowledge that even though Western science has been really reluctant to discuss the queerness of nature, that a lot of indigenous knowledge systems have included knowledge about queer animal behavior and celebrated it for countless generations. And Bruce Bagmel's book, Biological Exuberance, there's a great chapter where he goes through and he describes how in different indigenous cultures across Turtle Island, how knowledge about queer animal life has been transmitted orally and preserved in artwork. So these are just a few different nations across Turtle Island, and some of the species which they recognized as possessing some sort of queer characteristic, whether it's having same-sex sexual behavior or changing sex. And then millennia later, Western scientists came along and independently realized that those species were doing exactly those things. So it's another great example of indigenous people beating Western scientists by several thousand years with traditional ecological knowledge. And I've included a few sort of artistic examples from different cultures of some of these species. So Western science has not been kind historically to both queer scientists and naturalists and conservationists themselves, but also the possibility of queerness existing in nature. So this is probably one of the most notorious scientific papers, which gets into this territory. In 1987, the British entomologist John Tennant published an article on same-sex mating he'd observed in Moroccan butterflies, male butterflies he'd seen in the Atlas Mountains. And he chose to title that article, this is in an actual scientific journal called the Entomologist Record and Journal of Variation. He chose to title it A Note on the Apparent Lowering of Moral Standards in the Lepidoptera. And it opens with, it's a sad sign of our times that the national newspapers are all too often packed with lurid details of the declining moral standards and horrific sexual offenses committed by our fellow Homo sapiens. Perhaps it's also a sign of these times that the entomological literature appears of late to be headed in a similar direction. So just the full mask off, like overt homophobia. But there are some really great homophobic scientific article titles. There was one I saw recently that was like Sexual Aberration in the South African Ostrich, which was published in 1972 by the Auk. There's also one from the late 19th century called Sexual Perversion in Male Beetles, which I thought was particularly excellent. So there's still a lot of institutional barriers. This is a news story that happened very recently where the National Park Service, which is the organization in the US which administers national parks and employs thousands of conservationists, biologists, science communicators, and ironically enough is in charge of administering the Stonewall National Monument in New York City, which was the site of the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, which was a pivotal moment in queer and trans rights. They released an internal memo severely restricting the ability of their staff members to participate in Pride celebrations and outright banned rangers from participating in Pride marches and activities in their uniforms, which had never been a problem up until now. And of course, this was met with widespread outrage. And a few weeks later, they backpedaled and reversed their decision. But this is the sort of climate we're in. And as I mentioned earlier, yeah, scientists have been super reluctant in the past to publish their findings. A lot of the time, they've attempted to explain away the gay behavior they've observed. If there's same-sex sexual behavior in animals, they'll claim that it was a dominance display. Dominance display is like the classic stereotype if you can't understand animal behavior. But other things like a form of social bonding or a mistake on the animal's part. There's such a burden of proof to prove that any same-sex behavior going on in animals is real, versus any kind of heterosexual behavior is just assumed to be exactly what it appears to be. There's an intense double standard which has only recently started to be challenged. Um, Sometimes those scientific papers even get into language that's sort of similar to eugenics to suggest that there's no evolutionary function for queer animals, and therefore these animals shouldn't exist, which has all sorts of disturbing crossover into rhetoric around queer humans, and of course the way that the medical community, both historically and currently, pathologizes queerness and transness, and the effects that's had on queer people over the decades. Um, this was a post that went out at the beginning of June by Ontario Nature. It's a really cute Instagram, Facebook post with like two women in a field, pretty innocuous, saying Happy Pride Month. And of course, you get all these Facebook comments that are like perverts and like, complaining about all this stuff that the kids are learning at school. And we got a bunch of this too. We posted this post about how green frogs can change their sex, how neat that is. And we got these DMs about how we're grooming the children and encouraging them to amputate their body parts and all this sort of stuff, complaining about trans people. And so it's just sort of stuff you deal with on a daily basis. It's interesting to note that human gender is incredibly diverse across the world and in different cultural and historical contexts. So this is a map that I put together with just a taste of genders and concepts of gender which exist outside of male and female in different cultures all over the world, particularly in Turtle Island and among specific island cultures. It's super prevalent. And we see here like the Cree, the Ojibwe, even in like southern Italy, in Oman, in India, in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Aotearoa, Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, Tahiti, all over the world, the Zapotec people. There are concepts of gender which exist outside of male and female. And of course, there's a massive diversity of human queerness across history. So here we see examples from different historical periods, in different cultural contexts again. Academics talk about how homosexuality as a category or as a way of identifying yourself only really developed in Europe and North America in the late 19th century. The word homosexual dates back, I think, to the 1890s, around the time that Oscar Wilde was out on the scene. But in ancient Greece, for instance, there was no concept of homosexuality as an identity so much as homosexual acts between men were just a completely normal part of social life. We can see it in the Talmud, where there's 5 different genders described. That depiction there of the 2 men is from a tomb in ancient Egypt, where it was one of those great examples of historians being like, maybe they were just best friends, maybe they were roommates. These 2 Egyptian men spent their entire life together and were buried together and had their portrait on the wall of their tomb together. And historians are still like, they were probably good buddies. It's so funny, like that's such a stereotype. But I read a biography of a folk singer published last year. And in the research, the author found one of the woman friends of this folk singer, Connie Converse, was going through her diaries of her children and described Connie as mom's lesbian lover. And the author said, this is ambiguous. We don't know what this means. And this was published in 2023. And I was like, come on. But yeah, we see it in ancient Persia, in Greece, China, Japan, Korea, so many cultural contexts over time. A lot of researchers now think that the English language word eunuch that appears in English contemporary translations of the Bible probably refers to a variety of people, whether they were queer, intersex, um, had some sort of trans identity. Um, so it's all throughout different countries, different cultures, different continents throughout the centuries. Queerness has always been here. Trans people have always been here. And queerness has always existed in nature. Um, here's a few really great resources here. So there's some books. Biological Exuberance, as I mentioned before, is incredible. It's a large book. It's super detailed, super dense. So it's a little intimidating, maybe. Evolution's Rainbow by this amazing trans biologist named Joan Roughgarden is also similarly influential. It's a little bit more accessible, a little bit more entertaining. Queer Ducks by Elliot Shepherd was published only in 2022, but it's an amazing YA book. It's nonfiction. It has some comics in it. It's super funny, super sweet. And How Far the Light Reaches by Sabrina Imbler is a really cool non-binary writer, journalist, naturalist based in the States. It's one of my favorite books of all time. It's an incredible memoir, um, which is all about queerness and their life and relating it to the diversity of life in the ocean. Absolutely incredible. Can't recommend these books highly enough. There was recently a Nature of Things episode called Fluid, Life Beyond the Binary, which was really excellent. There's a documentary from 1999, believe it or not, which gives a fairly nuanced view of animal homosexuality from a series called Animals Like Us. That's available to watch free on YouTube. And the Nature of Things episode is available on CBC Gem for free. Well, and here's a couple of articles you can read online. One's in Scientific American called Why is Same-Sex Sexual Behavior So Common in Animals? Max Lambert, who was the co-author of that 2019 study on the green frogs changing sex, was one of the authors on that. And there's a Washington Post article called Queer Animals Are Everywhere, Science is Finally Catching Up. And that's by the same author as Queer Ducks. Those are both good introductions. So a little bit about me. As I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Maxwell. I am queer, I'm non-binary, I'm trans femme, and I am making a documentary about this stuff called Understanding Myself as an Amphibian. And we've been filming all over Southern Ontario, a cool variety of wildlife, whether it's frogs, salamanders, birds. We got to go to the collections of the Museum of Nature in Gatineau, Quebec to film that Gynandromorph evening grosbeak. We've shot in the ROM collections with Mark Peck. At the end of the month, I'm going to June with my crew to film an interview with a really exciting subject out there and to take in the Atlantic coast and all the salt marshes and horseshoe crabs and do some fun pride activities. There's some more really great interviews lined up. I just received a $1,000 grant from an organization called eFlora Trans Health, which is doing a lot of really great work. And we have an amazing crowdfunding campaign, and we've had some fantastic donors, including a few people who are here watching tonight. So I'd like to thank each and every one of you for supporting this project. I will throw a link in the chat in just a second. And that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if anyone wants to put any questions in the chat, please feel free to do so, and I will do my best to answer them. I went to art school, so I'm not an actual biologist. I don't have all the answers to your questions, but I do spend a lot of time looking for turtles and birds on weekends. Thank you, Lauren. All right. Any other comments? Any questions? My favorite queer animal that I've encountered this year? That's a really good question. Um, I think I think it's really neat this year to think so much about the green frog in this. Oh, thank you, Emily. to think about the green frog in this context because they are like probably the most common amphibian in most of northeastern North America. And there's something that naturalists a lot of the time sort of overlook and take for granted. But um, to come in with this understanding of their ability to change sex and to feel like such a strong kinship with that. I know one of the key themes of my film is sort of the crossover between, um, oh, is there anywhere you can follow my work? Yeah, I'll put my Instagram. And on Instagram, I have the hermit thrush, which is something of a bird. Yeah, to really be able to appreciate the green frog on that different level and to take a lot of time looking at them and appreciating the color and shape of them and everything like that. Like they're a beautiful species that's easy to overlook and forget about. All right. Oh yeah, didn't know Connie Converse was queer. Yeah. There was she's an amazing musician, but unfortunately that biography that came out last year was terrible. It was like borderline unreadable and I didn't finish it. But yeah, please go on Spotify and listen to Connie Converse. Amazing, forgotten folk singer of the 1950s that has only recently sort of started to get her due and become appreciated. Um, and yeah, thank you. Queer ecologist named Maxwell. So it's good to know that there's more than one of us, and Maxwell Lambert, the green frog scientist as well. So it seems to be a lot of us Maxwells out there. Thank you, Engo, as well. Um, yeah, if that's everything, I think I might end the webinar. But thank you all so much for coming here tonight. It really means a lot. Very affirming to have people's support and to know that people are interested in this stuff. And I hope everybody has an amazing Pride Month. And yeah, go out there, be trans, be gay, and have an amazing time. I love you all. Bye now.